Hi everyone, I'm Josh Eaton, CEO at Reaktiv Studios, and we are a digital agency, VIP Gold partner. We work with enterprise technology companies, media, and higher ed. And yeah, here today to talk about bringing the Xbox team to the block editor. And I've tried really hard to call it the block editor, but I'll probably call it Gutenberg a couple times. I can't really break that habit, so I'll do my best. And so some of the stuff I'm going to show you today, we actually launched today. No pressure, right? I think next time I'll choose a different topic. But it launched, and so I'm glad I didn't have to remove this slide. So it's really happy. So this is what it looks like. What we launched today was a redesign of the Xbox Wire sites. So there's Xbox Wire in English, and there's 4 other regional sites. There's a site called Mixer, and then Major Nelson that were all redesigned. Mixer is going to be a fast follow that launches. That one didn't launch today. But we also brought these remaining sites into the block editor. But what I'm going to go through is this whole process that started about a year and a half ago with Major Nelson, when we brought Major Nelson to the block editor, and kind of what our iterations were going through all those phases of taking them from what they had to the new site, now redesigned on the block editor. So why did we want to switch to the block editor? Besides the fact that we're going to have to at some point. It really comes down to user experience. So a lot of things they were doing, they were editing HTML manually. They had a lot of different shortcodes with a bunch of attributes, and it was just not a great experience. They also, their home pages were chronological. Gutenberg, the block editor, gives a lot more options for us to curate content on section pages and home pages and things like that. And they had some existing embed codes that would be great options for custom blocks, and actually have those render in the editor like they're going to look like on the front end. And something we determined in like our second iteration was a solution for their deals posts that really improved their workflow there. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So switching editors is really easy, right? It's not like a fundamental part of the content management system. You just upgrade and you're set, right? So some planning goes into this. And the time you spend planning for this upgrade is definitely going to be useful. It can be challenging, but planning to iterate is something that really helped for us. And so I can say that we planned for it to work this way all the way through, but that's not true. But this is how it ended up. We started the project back in maybe July of 2018. Started development on converting Major Nelson to the block editor, and got everything developed, got into testing, and then we ended up doing a second iteration when we uncovered some of those workflow improvements. And then it launched about March of this year. We moved the other sites onto VIP Go earlier this year, and then spent the last 3 months doing the redesign for all those and bringing them all into the block editor as well, which just launched today. So the first step when planning what we're going to do to get this into the block editor is figure out which post types we should move to the block editor. And the answer is all of them, right? Not really. We ended up moving one post type to start with Major Nelson. And there's sort of like a process that we went through to determine what would make the most sense. At some point, everything will be on the block editor. But given scope, timeline, budget considerations, and the actual use cases for these post types, we didn't necessarily move them all right away. So the first question we asked is, does it use the content editor? We have post types that are just using meta fields, not using the editor at all, and didn't have really unique layout needs. So those didn't really make sense for us to move right away, especially as we're trying to move quickly. So for those, we just kept them as custom fields, didn't migrate them to the block editor yet. If they are using the content editor, it's a good sign that it could be a good fit for the block editor. But even if you are using the editor, there might be meta boxes that don't output things. There might be There might be meta boxes that output things, but not within the main content area, so not in post content. And so for those, we use the plugin sidebar in the block editor, which was really nice. We use that for a couple things in this project. Our syndication feature between Major Nelson and the Xbox Wire sites, and for, I'll show you the product block later, but we have a way of putting that in like a sidebar, and that shows up and renders all in that plugin sidebar area. So in looking through the post types, posts were kind of an obvious choice. We knew those were going to move to the block editor. Podcasts, pages, and live events. We found out live events weren't used, so great choice of not moving to the block editor. And then pages just weren't heavily used on the site, so we did not move those just yet. The launch we did today moved pages across all the sites to the block editor as well, including home pages and things like that. Podcasts are something that we could move to the block editor in the future. Right now, the only thing in the content editor is the shortcode for the podcast player. So something we're looking at, but it wasn't something that was a priority just yet. So the way we selectively updated those was using the Gutenberg ramp plugin. It was a great plugin for this. You can choose specific post types or even specific post IDs and use Gutenberg just for those and use the classic editor with other ones as well. So that worked really well for this. So after that, after choosing your post types, we look through, what content partials, what pieces of data, what thing in there would make sense to be custom blocks. And again, it's everything, right? It's not. There are some shortcodes. You can use shortcodes in the block editor, and those still made sense to be shortcodes. Some of those were like jump to links to move within a page. The shortcodes work just fine. It didn't really improve the experience to make it a block, so we left those as is. For the podcast, they use SoundCloud, and the shortcode was the only thing in the editor. Since that's not on the block editor, we didn't make a block. But we could end up doing that in the future. Another consideration is how do you handle existing content? And this could either be really easy or really hard. I think the core team has done a great job with the classic block, and that it's made it really easy to upgrade posts to the editor, and all the content goes into the classic block. And typically, you're not going to have any issues with it rendering on the front end. So that's how we ended up handling this, with a little bit extra documentation, basically. So the first question to ask is, how frequently are you updating your legacy content? And if you're not, I'd recommend just leaving it. And so we basically skipped. We didn't try to migrate it all into Gutenberg. There is the feature to convert the classic editor to blocks, which is really handy. But depending on what's in your content, it can choke on certain things. So what we did is tested that out across kind of like a sample of all the different types of post layouts they had in the post type, and then wrote up documentation to say, if you're converting this kind of post, this is going to break, and this is how you fix it. And that made it, instead of us sinking a bunch of development time into trying to automatically move everything into blocks, they have a method of doing that themselves, only if they need to, which is not very frequently. We did look into some options for automatically migrating, and I don't have a great solution right then because we haven't done that yet. Maybe some of you have, but we looked at scripting in Node, basically like the convert to block stuff and running through the post that way, but not something we have done at this point. There's also going to be a lot of manual verification needed if you're doing that type of automated migration, so it'd definitely be a lot of work. Training is another thing to consider. Luckily, we didn't find that the team needed a lot of training for this. They were already familiar with WordPress, and once they got in and were testing the editor, they really liked it. But there are a lot of resources out there. The main things that we did was to document all of our custom blocks, all the features and options they have, how to use them, and then did a demo walking through everything and recorded that for them. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as you're transitioning to the block editor. So then, after speccing out all the blocks, we document everything. This is how we're going to build it, and that's what drives our QA process. So we agree this is how everything's going to be built, and then that's what we refer to in our QA phase to make sure, did we build what we said we were going to build? And we began development on the blocks and other block editor features. Spun up a new pre-prod environment on VIP so that we can still make changes to the existing site while we're building everything in Gutenberg, and we're not blocked there. So now I'm going to walk through some of the blocks we created in each iteration. So we started on the Major Nelson site and looking with basically what they had that were shortcodes, what they had that were like embeds or things that didn't come with core Gutenberg or weren't things that would be like available in a block library. So we came up with these 3 blocks. Hopefully my GIFs, they do, not GIFs, GIFs. So this is the countdown timer block. The Major Nelson site has a lot of deals posts, hundreds of deals in a single post, and many of them expire because the deals are only good for a certain amount of time. So this block, it renders just like it does on the front end, and put in the date you want it to expire, and it will actually expire the post itself right from this block. Then there's the product block. So this is something that's a Microsoft Store specific. They have an embed in an iframe basically that loads prices, ratings by button for games and things in the store. And this was a pretty manual process before, and we got it down to where they just had to have the product ID, and then they had layout options with that badge type drop down there. And then it renders the iframe just like it would on the front end. And then content block. This one is probably the most complicated block. It's basically a div that floats to the right. This was a shortcode that they had, and this is just a nicer experience than having a shortcode in there. It was not complicated. So then that's everything we did based on our planning. So everything that we went through, mapping old site to new site, we developed that, put it in testing, and the Xbox team started testing out the new editor, testing the blocks, and they really liked it. And as they were going through that, they realized, oh, wow, this is great. This could probably help us with our deals posts. Not something we had talked about up to this point. But basically, the deals posts look like this. This is in the new design. You see the countdown timer. And then you have this giant table of hundreds of deals in every post, and they do this weekly. And they were doing it just manually, taking a spreadsheet and copying it all in into just a hard-coded HTML table within the post content. So it was a lot of work. It took a long time, and it wasn't very efficient. So we basically created a modification to the table block where you create a block. There's a box to check saying it's a Major Nelson table. You can upload a Excel file, and it loads all the deals in. And at that point, it works just like a regular table block, but it's styled like the Major Nelson block. So this one was slightly more complicated than the content block, and had a huge improvement on their workflow. And then the third iteration, which launched today, was our redesign. So this is where we brought the other 5 sites in and identified what features would work well for those, particularly for homepage curation and things like that. So we had 4 new blocks, and we also extended the columns blocks so they would have some pre-configured layouts. Wouldn't have to manually set the columns every time. First one is the Twitter feed. It goes at the top of the homepage. After adding it, you can add a comma-delimited list of Twitter handles, so they can add Xbox, they can add Major Nelson, and it'll show all those together. A couple settings in there, and then it just renders just like it does on the front end. And it live updates as you're typing, so you can get some really weird results as you're typing in Twitter handles. Single post, this one's not a GIF, just a screenshot. But this, right now, this is an example of it being used in the hero spot. But there's a post selector. You can search and filter all the posts to find the one you need. Tells you what's selected, and then choose layouts. This has, I think, 4 or 5 layouts based on image size, orientation, and all this stuff. The feed block, this one's pretty cool in that it's basically a post list block, but it tracks all the other feed blocks that are on the page, so that you could have a feed block with 5 posts in it, and then add a speed bump or an ad, and then another feed block from the same category or just recent, and it knows which posts have already been displayed, and then displays the next ones in the pagination of the query. So you could do 10 of these with one in from one category. You could also alternate categories, so it'll keep track of the same query in the other blocks. So they use this heavily on their home pages for these sites. Speed bump, this one is basically choose a post and output it as a speed bump. Used a lot on the home page, and it renders similar to how it looks on the front end. The summary module, this one is also a pretty simple one. It's for bulleted lists at the beginning of a post, kind of like a TLDR that you see frequently on blogs. The thing we did different here was we made this into a block template, so they want these on all the posts, and so the block template was, I think, 5 lines of code. So it's a really simple way to improve workflow, and so this, even though it's just adding one block, it's really helpful to the team. So it's a really nice feature of the block editor. So what else can you do? I've talked about a couple of the things like the plugin sidebar, block templates, and how well you can match your styling in the editor to the front end. But this is something that was one of our big takeaways, was looking at a migration is not just looking at what you have and how that translates to the block editor, but thinking about, okay, what's new that's possible with the block editor that maybe you couldn't do before. Like the deals table is a good example there, where it wasn't a short code. It wasn't even something we were that aware of as being a pain point. And once we found that, the block editor had a great solution for that. And then Iterate. We started really small and kind of just went block by block through these sites. Started with one site, ended up with 6. And there's just so much you can do with the block editor. And planning it out from the beginning and iterating a little bit at a time was a really great approach for these sites. So thank you very much. It was really nice of all of you to come and celebrate the launch with me. So thanks very much. And I'll take any questions you have. Yeah.
Did you consider any layout stuff and come up with challenges, or did you just go single column? I saw that the align right or float right, but yeah. Any other layout stuff that you considered?
Yeah, for these sites, they didn't have a lot of that in terms of they don't do a lot of landing pages or things like that where they need a bunch of different layouts. We did extend the column block for a couple of, some pages have sidebar, some pages don't, and kind of adjustments there. But it wasn't really a requirement for these sites to do that.
Yeah. Not a little bit of block development. One of the things that I get a little hung up on sometimes, but kind of curious to hear your thoughts on it, is where to do the data entry to the block. So I noticed for a product, you would enter it into the editor of the actual block versus if the footer handles, you're putting in the block detail handle. I didn't know if you had given any kind of over general thoughts about where the best way to handle, how the best way to handle that kind of stuff is, or where those practices work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a great answer for you either.
Generally, properties in the sidebar, content in the block.
Yeah, Jake said content in the block, properties in the sidebar, kind of like that.
But it is a little fuzzy, right? That's been my interpretation.
It is kind of fuzzy, and the UI for switching it from front end rendering to editing can be a little weird and a little hard to get used to as well. So in some cases, the sidebar might work well for those kind of things, especially if you're rendering an embed or something like that.
Can you talk a bit about the QA process for all of the posts that you migrated to the block editor? Did the Xbox team QA them, manually? Did they sort of cherry pick some? How did that work?
Yeah, we didn't QA everything, but definitely cherry pick from a sample selection of posts. We did all that ourselves and then turned it over to the Xbox team to do that as well, across many different people. But yeah, it was just doing a sample and then kind of letting them loose on the site. So we made sure to have that representative examples to make sure everything looked good. We really didn't have any issues with the classic block. in terms of like the legacy content. That was more on like the redesign side, QAing that. But in terms of QAing the actual block editor migration, that was mostly in terms of like how does this work when you're creating pages and posts, like the editing experience, and then how's that markup turning out on the front end.
I'm assuming that you had some brand styles that you had to use in addition to your own back-end styles. So where were all the styles sheets stored and where were they linked?
Yeah, so we're looking for a better solution here in terms of sharing between Gutenberg and the front end. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of we kind of have to restyle it, because when we just import the front end styles, they're in the theme. So the theme has our front end styles, but then our blocks plugins also have like the styles for the editor. And so it's kind of duplicated there in terms of we can share certain SAS partials and things like that between the projects, but in terms of like we can't just import the style sheet directly. That kind of ruins everything. So there's a little bit of duplicate work there. We're trying to work on ways to improve that.
You mentioned documenting custom blocks for the client. What did I mean?
Basically a Google Doc with screenshots and steps to add, so describing where the blocks are available, what all the options are available, showing the different layouts and how they look. Pretty much that. They did. But we had to use Teams for all of our calls. Yeah.
When you think about designing these more complex blocks that have the kind of data, what are the elements that you can, what are the ingredients you get to complete layout, content?
Anything really, in terms of like anything you can query, anything you can build from settings fields. There's a lot of possibilities there to like remix and mix things in there. Yeah.
First, congrats on launch.
Thanks.
2 questions. So how much legacy content was there? And was it so much that that's why you decided to keep it in the classic block editor? And 2, you just finished the 2nd revision. Is there going to be a 3rd revision or to get all the other stuff that didn't make the cut this time? Or is it just basically you just left there and then
Yeah.
they decide to do it in the future, or if they have an in-house team, are they going to do it or are they going to?
Yeah, so thousands and thousands of posts. So that's part of the reason why it didn't make sense to go back and try to convert everything. In terms of whether there will be another revision, yes. There's already plans to do that. A lot of things that we push to like a later phase in terms of things we can support. I don't think we'll go back and convert all of the legacy content to Gutenberg though. They just don't update past posts. Like for example, a deals post from 2 years ago doesn't really need to be updated. So it's just not it's not like they have long form content that's evergreen or something that's going to be things that need to be updated again and again. So that part we won't do, but absolutely we're still iterating on it. We definitely want to improve the styling in the admin and the experience there as much as we can. That's one of our big focuses. And we have a whole backlog of a bunch of other things we want to do. So yeah, still ongoing, just kind of like the initial redesign launch. Yes?
Did you keep any of the WordPress provided blocks, or did you only give them blocks that you had created, and how did you manage that?
Yeah, so all of the default core blocks are there. On other projects, we've used block libraries. There's a couple good plugins out there that have some standard blocks that you can use. We didn't use that on this project, so they still have the ability to use all of the core blocks, and those are all styled as well. So they have that ability plus these custom blocks that we built for them. Yep. Any other questions? All right, I'll be here all night as well.